Hi all, it's Dr. Rebecca Barrett Fox, Professor of Sociology at Arkansas State University. This week we're going to look at historical contemporary feminist social movements. But I want to begin this lecture with a personal story about one of my very favorite people, my Nana. Nana was the nickname of my great-great-aunt. Her real name was Pamela, like Camilla, but with a P, and I have no idea where it came from, but it's also my grandmother's name. My Nana was my paternal grandmother's aunt, the sister of my Grammy, my great-grandmother. Nana was old when I was born, and she died when I was in 8th grade, so she lived a long time. She was born in 1898, the only person I personally knew born in the century before me. I was amazed at that fact alone. Someone born during the same century as the Civil War, before the U.S., as we know it today, was completed, since Oklahoma and New Mexico and Arizona hadn't even entered the nation to give us the continental U.S. Well, Nana lived with my grandmother, her niece, during her old age, so I was lucky to get to see her very often. She was slow-moving but lively, even as she neared 100. Anyway, my Nana was my favorite because she was always willing to talk to me about life, quote-unquote, back then. I knew that sometimes this was difficult for her because her life had not always been easy. Her only child had been murdered or possibly jumped overboard, but in any case killed, on a steamboat during a fight about gambling and debts. And before that, his alcoholism had already broken her heart. Still, we would talk about other things, like suffrage, the early 20th century movement for women to get to vote. The 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote, passed in 1919. So she would have been a young woman had she gone to college, about college age. The perfect age, I thought, to join in the protest, to hoist a protest sign in front of Woodrow Wilson's White House. So, imagine how disappointed I was when my Nana said that she had not been part of the fight for the right to vote. I knew my Nana to be an independent woman. After all, she'd never remarried, despite being widowed young, and she lived on her own until she was in her late 80s. And she wasn't afraid of breaking convention. She was a religious radical, a Quaker, but she also continued, until she passed away, to color her hair bright red. It was barely a wisp of soft down on her head in her old age, and she was unable to bend the whole way over the sink to color it, so the hair dye never reached its roots. The result was a Q-tip-like fluff, white on the bottom, then orange, then at the tip, the most unnatural color red imaginable. Well, that kind of woman must have been a radical. And anyway, we lived just a short distance from Washington, D.C. How come she wasn't a suffragette? Well, I don't know why my Nana wasn't a suffragette, and I was too polite to tell her how disappointed I was. It was like finding out that your parents or your grandparents could have gone to Woodstock, but decided to stay home to play Trivial Pursuit instead. Only this was worse because this wasn't about rock and roll, but about democracy. What could have been more important to a young person? So was my Nana a feminist? She set out the effort for women to win the right to vote. That doesn't seem very feminist. But she was an active part of another important feminist movement of the early 20th century, the temperance movement. Temperance was the effort to abolish the sale of alcohol, and it led to the passage of the only constitutional amendment to be repealed, the 18th Prohibition. It made the production and sale of alcohol illegal. Today we often associate it with busybodies who want to stamp out sin, and to be frank, with Protestant Americans who didn't like the Catholic immigrants coming to the U.S. at the time from Italy, Ireland, and Eastern Europe. One way of making it clear that these folks were quote-unquote un-American was by making their beer and wine drinking illegal. But the temperance movement was also a feminist movement. Its leaders were largely women, and all of its most important leaders were women, some of whom had been active in the abolition of slavery earlier. Some of them were radical women, like Carrie Nation, who took an axe and whacked barrooms to bits. She also went on a speaking tour and paid her way through life, riling up crowds and giving public speeches against alcohol. But many of these women were women who intimately knew that alcohol hurt women and children tremendously. Carrie Nation herself was widowed due to alcoholism, and lots of other women had similar experiences. Drinking was one of American men's favorite pastimes. We drank a lot more back then than we do today, and bars were often also attached to houses of prostitution, or prostitution was a lucrative side business for many bar owners. Remember that this was a time before women could easily divorce their husbands, and when, if they did, they would have had a hard time remarrying or finding employment. Domestic abuse and rape within marriage were not crimes, and women could not really easily own property apart from their husbands. Commercial sex was not illegal in many places, and even where it was, laws against prostitution weren't enforced. STDs were rampant, but there was no penicillin to help women or their babies born with STDs or STIs. They caught syphilis, they caught other diseases from their husbands. Well, outlawing alcohol may now seem like an ineffective way of dealing with these problems. Right? These are problems of domestic abuse, violence, death, infertility, and other illnesses related to STDs. It's a lot of problems. Could getting rid of just alcohol solve it? Well, women knew that they had a better chance of making alcohol illegal than they did of reforming men individually. They could cut off the supply of booze, they hoped they could save lives. Like the life of my Nana's son. Her temperance work was due in part to his death. If only he hadn't been a drinker, he wouldn't have gotten on that riverboat, wouldn't have gone gambling, wouldn't have gotten into that fight, would have grown into a man she could have been proud of, given her grandchildren of her own, and maybe she then would have been living with them rather than with her niece. Well, my Nana was a true believer in temperance, and I loved her, and I was terrified of the sins and tragedies that she assigned to alcohol. So I became one of the world's youngest, I'm pretty sure, members of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the WCTU, which is the late 19th and early 20th century organization that led the charge for prohibition. For all I know, my siblings and I, we all took the white ribbon pledge to abstain from alcohol for the rest of our lives, are the last living WCTU members. For my Nana, this was a feminist endeavor, even though she wouldn't have probably used the word feminist to describe herself. She wanted to help women and children live lives where they didn't have to fear violence, disease, or poverty because of some man's alcoholism. My Nana couldn't envision no-fault divorce, or the invention of protection from abuse orders, or crisis centers for women fleeing domestic abuse, but she did have a feminist vision of a world in which drunk men couldn't hurt women and children. So I'll ask again, was my Nana a feminist? Or the bigger question, what does one have to do to be a feminist? Surely, belief that people of all genders are equal is central, as well as the recognition that women have historically been denied their rights and been oppressed. But what else do you need? Can you believe that some of the differences in outcomes for men and women are due to biology, or do you have to assign every difference to culture? Do you have to support the right of women to have abortions under all circumstances, under some circumstances, but not all circumstances? If you're white, do you have to believe in black liberation? Can you be a white feminist, but also racist? Do you have to believe in gay rights? Do you have to believe in trans rights? Sometimes feminists who oppose trans rights are sometimes derisively called TERFs. That's for trans-exclusive radical feminists. In other words, how intersectional does your feminism have to be? Does it have to be anti-capitalist, Anti-colonial, fat-accepting, concerns about rights for people with disabilities? Does it have to be vegan or animal rights oriented? Well, I don't have answers for you, but these are some of the questions I hope you'll consider and talk about with your friends and classmates as you engage the assigned materials this week. As always, if you have questions about what you read or watch this week, please let me know.